For today's lesson, we're going to be converting and comparing fractions, decimals, and percents. Let's recall the rules for converting. As we go from a fraction and as we convert to a decimal, we know we divide. And when we go from a decimal to a percent, we multiply by 100. We know that that ends up moving the decimal 2 places to the right. And what about when we go backwards? Well, when you start at a percent and you move to a decimal, you're going to divide by 100. And we know that has an effect. That takes the decimal point and it moves it 2 places to the left. And as we go from a decimal to a fraction, we actually read. For example, if we have 0.7, we read that as 7/10. So as a fraction, you would write it 7/10. If you can, reduce, but in this case, you can't. So with these rules in mind, we're going to do some converting and comparing. And when it comes to comparing, the best form, I believe, for making a comparison is decimal form. So let's take a look at 3 different forms and let's compare them. We're going to find the greatest value. In your notebook, please jot down these 3 values. The fraction 3/4, the decimal 0.709, which is 709 thousandths, and lastly, jot down 80%. Make sure you mark a decimal point behind the 0. Now, in order to make a comparison, we need to convert all of these values to decimal form. Let's begin. We know that our middle value is already in decimal form. We're good. We don't need to mess with that particular decimal. But take a look at 3/4. Grab your calculator, and many of you have this memorized already, but 3 divided by 4, punch that in, you should get 75 hundredths, 0.75. Now let's bring down our other decimal, which is already in good form. And lastly, let's take 80% and convert it back to a decimal. You should get 0.8. Now, the first value is to the hundredths place, the second to the thousandths, and then of course 0.8 is to the tenths place. Let's add some insignificant zeros so that all of our values extend to the thousandths place. This makes comparing so much easier. Take a look and compare each one of these. 750 thousandths, 709 thousandths, or 800 thousandths. Clearly, this is the greatest value. You can also use a different technique. Another way to compare is to just look at the largest place value, which happens to be the tenths place, and you can clearly see that 8/10 is larger than 7/10. So clearly, once again, the third option is the largest. Make sure you're recording these notes in your spiral notebook. Let's try another one. In your notebook, please jot down these three values: the fraction 5/6, the decimal 0.811 thousandths, and the percentage 82%. And remember, the decimal lives behind the 2. Now, grab your calculator and let's convert our first value, the fraction 5/6, to a decimal. 5 divided by 6. Please enter that into your calculator. You should get 0.8333, we'll use 3 dots, repeating. It's a repeating decimal. For the next one, let's just jot down 0.811 or 811 thousandths. And for our percentage, let's move the decimal 2 places to the right. And we know that's 82 hundredths. Now, we can use a variety of techniques to compare. I like to make my decimals look as similar as possible. And that's done by adding several zeros to each of these. And maybe it's clear to you at this point which is the greater value. Or you can look at place values. Start in the tenths place. You can see it's a tie. But if you go to the hundredths place and make your comparison, you can clearly see that the 3 is larger than the 1 or the 2. And this, of course, is your greatest value. One more problem, and then when you're done taking notes and practicing these problems, you can go on to take the quiz. Jot down these 3 values in your notebook: the fraction 3/5, the decimal 0.599 or 599 thousandths, and finally 59%. Okay, let's get everybody into decimal form. Take your calculator and punch in 3 divided by 5. Some of you already have this memorized. You should have gotten 0.6 or 6/10. Bring down the next value. And then lastly, take your percentage and convert it back into a decimal. You should get 59 hundredths. Now, my first one is to the tenths place, the second to the thousandths place, and the third to the hundredths place. For comparison's sake, I'm going to add some insignificant zeros so that all 3 numbers are out to the thousandths place. Take a look, this comparison's easy. 600 thousandths, 599 thousandths, or 590 thousandths. Clearly, my first value is the biggest. You could also compare starting in the tenths place and simply see that 6/10 is greater than either of these. Clearly, the biggest value is the fraction 3/5. In my second problem, the largest value was 5/6. And in my first problem, the largest value was 80%. Now, use your notes to take the quiz associated with this lesson. This concludes the lesson in comparing fractions, decimals, and percents.